He didn't look like he belonged there, and that was exactly the problem. A single father in a faded work jacket sitting quietly among Manhattan's most powerful people. No designer suit, no title on a business card, no one to vouch for him. Within minutes, the head of security had him by the arm, ready to drag him out in front of hundreds of guests. But what none of them knew, not the billionaires, not the cameras, not the woman who would soon walk through those doors, was that this man had already walked into hell once before, and he'd done it to save one of them. Drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay with me until the end. The invitation had come in the mail 11 days ago, tucked inside a plain white envelope with the Carter Enterprises logo embossed in the upper left corner. Logan Steele almost threw it in the recycling bin. He'd held it over the trash can for a solid 5 seconds, staring at the gold lettering on the card inside. Annual Horizon Gala, the Meridian Grand Hotel, Manhattan. Friday, October 11th, black tie preferred. Before Sophie had come running in from the kitchen with flour on both hands and looked at him with those big brown eyes that made it impossible to say no to anything. "What's that, Daddy?" "An invitation to a fancy party." "Are we going?" He'd looked at the card again. Black tie preferred. He owned one tie. It was navy blue and had a small stain on the narrow end from Sophie's birthday 3 years ago when she'd knocked a glass of fruit punch into his chest and cried about it for 40 minutes, even though he'd told her at least a dozen times that it was fine, that he didn't care about the tie. "Maybe," he'd said, which for Logan Steele was almost always a no. But the invitation had explained that the gala was raising funds for the Meridian Children's Hospital, specifically for the pediatric burn unit and a new rehabilitation wing for kids who'd survived severe injuries. Logan had read that part 3 times. He thought about some of the men he'd served with. He thought about the kids he'd seen overseas. And then he thought about Sophie, who was 9 years old and healthy and currently covering his kitchen counter in what appeared to be an ambitious attempt at homemade biscuits. He put the invitation on the refrigerator. He never RSVP'd, technically. He just showed up. Okay. The Meridian Grand Hotel sat on the corner of 57th and Park, like it had been placed there by someone who wanted everyone walking past to feel slightly inadequate. Limestone facade, brass revolving doors, doormen in long coats who opened car doors with practiced precision. The line of vehicles pulling up that Friday evening was a parade of black SUVs and town cars, and every person stepping out of them wore something that probably cost more than Logan's monthly mortgage payment. Logan arrived by subway. He'd almost taken a cab, but the 4 train had shown up just as he reached the platform stairs, and he took that as a sign to stop overthinking everything and just get on. He wore the nicest thing he owned, a charcoal gray button-down that fit well enough across the shoulders, dark slacks that he'd had dry cleaned for the first time since his wife's memorial service, and the navy tie with the stain on the narrow end, which he made sure was tucked under when he knotted it. Over everything, because the October air had a bite to it, and he hadn't thought to bring anything else, he wore his old work jacket, dark canvas, faded at the elbows, with his name stitched in white thread over the left breast pocket, from the 2 years he'd spent doing construction work after getting out of the Navy. Steel. He'd thought about leaving the jacket in a locker somewhere. He'd talked himself out of that because it was cold, and because he wasn't going to pretend to be something he wasn't. He'd been to places where people got shot at, and he'd come home. He could handle a charity gala. Sophie walked beside him with her small hand tucked into his, wearing a navy blue dress with white trim that they'd found at a consignment shop 2 weeks ago and that she had declared was basically perfect. Her hair was in 2 braids because Logan had spent 6 months watching YouTube tutorials after her mother died and had gotten genuinely competent at 2 specific hairstyles, 2 braids and a ponytail. And Sophie had long ago stopped mentioning that there were other options. She was carrying a small envelope. Inside it was $43. She'd been saving since September. Birthday money from her grandparents, a few dollars here and there from her piggy bank, 2 weeks of skipping the vending machine at school. She decorated the envelope herself with colored pencils, drawing small red crosses and stick figures of children with bandages, and then, in careful block letters across the front, for the kids who need it more. Logan had tried to talk her out of bringing it, not because he wasn't proud of her. He was, in a way that felt almost too big to fit in his chest. but because he didn't want her to feel small standing next to people who were probably going to be writing checks with a lot of zeros on them. "You know, there are going to be billionaires there," he'd said while they were on the train. "People who donate millions of dollars." Sophie had looked at him very seriously. "I know. So your $43 is $43 that the kids didn't have before," she said. "Right?" He had no answer for that. They rode the rest of the way in silence, Sophie looking out the window at the tunnel walls rushing past, Logan looking at his daughter. The ballroom of the Meridian Grand was everything the lobby promised, and then some. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed to start somewhere around the 20-foot mark. Round tables were draped in ivory and gold, set with china and silverware that caught the light in small, sharp flashes. The stage at the far end was framed with white floral arrangements the size of small cars. A string quartet played somewhere near the back. Waitstaff moved through the room with trays of champagne and small plates of food that Logan didn't recognize and probably couldn't pronounce. He found the table numbers along the edge of the room and located table 17 without much trouble. He settled Sophie into her chair, handed his jacket to a coat check attendant who appeared out of nowhere, and sat down with his back to the wall out of habit. Old training. You always want to see the room. What he noticed right away was that nobody looked like him. The men at the surrounding tables wore tuxedos or dark designer suits. The women wore gowns. Jewelry caught the light everywhere he looked. People were laughing and shaking hands and kissing cheeks with the easy familiarity of people who'd been in the same rooms together for decades. Business cards changed hands over appetizers. Someone at the next table was talking loudly about a deal he'd closed in Singapore. Another man was explaining his portfolio strategy to a woman who was nodding with the specific expression of someone who stopped listening 20 seconds ago. Logan poured Sophie a glass of water. She had her envelope in her lap and was looking around the ballroom with wide eyes, taking everything in the way 9-year-olds take things in, completely without filters. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Yeah. That lady's necklace is probably worth more than our whole house." "Probably," he agreed. "That's weird." "Yeah," he said. "It is." The trouble started about 20 minutes in, before the formal program had even begun. Logan had gotten up twice, once to get Sophie a plate from the appetizer station because she'd spotted something she thought might be shrimp, and once to ask a waiter for a Coke because the champagne that kept appearing on their table wasn't going to work for either of them. He'd spoken to no one, smiled at the people who made eye contact, kept to himself. He was good at keeping to himself. He didn't notice the head of security watching him until the man was already halfway across the room. His name, Logan would later learn, was Garrett Holt. 6'4", built like a refrigerator that had spent some time at the gym, with a shaved head and a black earpiece and the particular kind of confidence that came from being the biggest person in most rooms he entered. He moved through the ballroom with the deliberate slowness of someone who'd already made a decision and was simply executing it, and he was looking directly at Logan. Logan saw him coming and set down his water glass. Holt stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at Logan's button-down, at the navy tie, at the slacks. He looked at the old work jacket that was now over the back of Logan's chair because the coat check attendant had handed it back when Logan asked him to. He looked at Sophie, who had her colored pencil envelope in front of her, and was coloring in one of the stick figures with a red crayon she'd had in her backpack. "Sir?" Holt's voice was low enough to not carry too far, which Logan recognized as a professional courtesy, the kind designed to let you retreat with some dignity before things escalated. "I need to see your invitation." Logan looked up at him calmly. "I don't have it with me." "You don't have your invitation." "I left it at home. My daughter has a backpack that's basically a black hole. I didn't want to risk losing it." This was partially true. He'd also just forgotten it. Holt studied him. "What's your name?" "Logan Steele." Holt pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what Logan assumed was the guest list. The slight pause before his next response told Logan everything. "Mr. Steele, I'm not finding you on our confirmed guest list." "I got an invitation in the mail. Carter Enterprises sent it. A lot of people receive invitations. Confirmed attendance requires—" "I didn't know I had to RSVP. It said on the card." Logan thought about this. It probably had said that. He hadn't read the whole card. "You're right," he said. I should have done that. I apologize. The apology seemed to throw Holt off for a second. He'd probably expected pushback. He recovered quickly. I understand, sir, but without confirmation, I'm not able to allow you to remain at a reserved seat. If you'd like to speak with someone at the registration desk, can I take my daughter and get something to eat first? Something shifted in Holt's expression, a door closing somewhere behind his eyes. I'm going to need you to come with me now, sir. We haven't eaten. Sir? She's 9. Logan kept his voice completely even. He wasn't angry. He wasn't going to be angry, but he also wasn't going to move. She walked in here with her little envelope and $43 she saved up to donate to sick kids. She's eating something first. The word 9-year-old had carried across the table, and people were starting to notice. Logan felt it, the subtle drop in ambient noise that happens when enough people in a room start paying attention to the same thing. Heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Holt didn't lower his voice when he spoke again, and that was when the calculation changed. Sir, I need you to come with me, or I'm going to have to involve additional security. This is a private event, and you are not confirmed on the guest list. I need you to leave. The word leave landed loud enough for 3 tables to hear it clearly. Sophie looked up from her envelope. She'd stopped coloring. Daddy? It's okay, Bug, Logan said without taking his eyes off Holt. Keep coloring. The seconds that followed felt longer than they were. Logan stood slowly, not quickly, not with any aggression, just stood because he was tired of looking up and because standing was what you did when something needed to be addressed directly. He had maybe 4 inches on Holt in terms of reach and very slightly less in height, and he stood in a way that made it clear he understood the geometry of the situation without making it a threat. You're doing your job, Logan said quietly. I understand that, but I'd appreciate it if we could keep this between us and not make it a thing in front of my daughter. Holt's jaw tightened. Come with me, sir. I'm not going anywhere until she finishes eating. 2 more security personnel appeared, materializing from different corners of the room with the smooth efficiency of people who'd been watching and waiting for a signal. They wore the same black jackets, same earpieces. They positioned themselves at angles, professional, well-practiced. The string quartet had stopped playing. The whole room was watching now, 400 people, some of them among the most powerful individuals in the country. And every single one of them had turned toward table 17 to see what was happening. Logan could feel their attention like a physical weight. Some of them were holding their champagne glasses mid-sip. One man near the front had his phone half raised. Logan didn't look at any of them. He was looking at his daughter, who had put down her red crayon and was gripping the edge of the table with both hands, her knuckles pale, her eyes moving between her father and the 3 large men surrounding their table. It's okay, he said to her again, softer this time, just for her. She didn't look like she believed him. Holt stepped forward. His hand came up and closed around Logan's arm just above the elbow. Not violent, but firm, the kind of grip designed to start movement without asking permission. I'm asking you one more time to come with me. Logan looked down at the hand on his arm. He took a breath. He'd been grabbed before. In worse places, by worse people, for higher stakes. He'd learned a long time ago that the moment you let your body react before your brain decides is the moment everything goes sideways. And going sideways was a luxury he couldn't afford with Sophie 6 feet away watching everything with those wide brown eyes. So he breathed. And then the doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. Sophie, who had been frozen in her chair, suddenly slipped out of it. Sophie, Logan started, but she was already moving, her little dress swishing, her braids bouncing, and she did something that nobody expected. She walked straight to Holt and looked up at him with an expression that wasn't frightened at all. It was the expression of a 9-year-old who has decided that enough is enough. Excuse me, she said. Holt looked down at her, startled. That's my dad. Sophie held up her envelope, the colored pencil drawings, the stick figure children with bandages, for the kids who need it more. We came here to give this to the hospital. My dad brought me because it's a family gala. We got an invitation. He left it at home because I put too much stuff in my backpack, and he was worried it would get lost. That part is kind of my fault. Nobody moved. Sophie looked around at the room, 400 people staring at her, all that crystal and gold and money and power. And she didn't flinch. She held her envelope a little higher. We just want to give our donation and eat something because we came straight from school pickup and I'm really hungry. She looked back up at Holt. Can we please stay? The silence in the ballroom was complete. And then before Holt could answer, before anyone could say anything at all, a voice came from the entrance behind them. What's going on here? The woman who just walked in was 30 years old and had the particular quality of someone who entered rooms and immediately understood the power balance of everything in them. Evelyn Carter wore a deep burgundy gown and had her dark hair pinned up, and there was a small headset microphone still clipped to her collar from the media interview she'd just wrapped up in the lobby. She was still holding a folded sheet of notes in her left hand. She'd clearly intended to make a quiet entrance through the side door and find her seat before the program started. She had not expected to walk in on this. Her assistant leaned in to murmur something. Evelyn held up a hand. Not now. And walked forward, her eyes moving over the scene. The 3 guards, the crowd of 400 people staring, the little girl in the navy dress holding a hand-decorated envelope, and the man standing calmly in the center of all of it with his hand at his side and his faded work jacket over his chair. Evelyn Carter stopped walking. She stopped completely. The color did something complicated in her face. Her assistant spoke again. She didn't hear it, because she knew that face. She had spent 3 years trying to decide whether she would ever forget it. The broad shoulders, the stillness, the way he stood like someone who had learned a long time ago that panic costs you more than it solves. The small scar along his jaw that she'd noticed when he'd carried her out of the burning building and set her down on the pavement outside and immediately turned around and gone back in. He hadn't known her name. She'd been too disoriented from the smoke to tell him. By the time the paramedics got to her, by the time anyone thought to ask who had carried her out, he was already gone. She had spent money and time and considerable corporate resources trying to find out who he was. She had never managed it, until right now. Logan Steele, she said softly. He turned. He looked at her. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of it. And then he nodded once, slowly. Ma'am, he said. Evelyn turned to Garrett Holt. When she spoke, her voice was completely controlled, the kind of controlled that is more frightening than loud. Please tell me, she said, what exactly is happening here? Holt straightened. This individual arrived without confirmed RSVP and doesn't have his invitation. Standard protocol. Standard protocol, Evelyn repeated. Yes, ma'am. She looked at the 3 guards. She looked at Logan. She looked at Sophie, who was still holding her envelope up like a small flag. His name is Logan Steele, she said, and 3 years ago I would not be standing in this room if it weren't for him. The ballroom didn't make a sound. So whatever the protocol is, Evelyn continued, adjust it. Evelyn Carter had not spoken those words loudly. She hadn't needed to. The Meridian Grand's ballroom had the particular acoustics of a space designed to carry sound. High ceilings, hard marble floors beneath the carpeting, walls that reflected rather than absorbed. When she said adjust it, the words moved through 400 people like a current through still water. You felt it before you fully processed it. Garrett Holt stood very still. The 2 guards behind him exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, but communicated everything. We may have miscalculated this one. Holt's hand was no longer on Logan's arm. At some point during Evelyn's entrance, he'd released it, probably without fully deciding to, the way your body sometimes makes corrections before your brain catches up. Ms. Carter, Holt said carefully, I was simply following. I heard what you were following. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at Logan with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite relief, not quite disbelief, something that sat between the two and didn't have a clean name. Logan Steele, Logan said. You already said that. It came out before he thought about it, and for a half second something flickered across his face that might have been the beginning of an apology, but Evelyn surprised him. She laughed. Not a polished social event laugh. A real one. Short and slightly startled. The kind that escapes before you can make it presentable. I did, she agreed. I did say that. Sophie, who had lowered her envelope somewhere in the last 60 seconds but was still gripping it with both hands, looked up at her father with an expression that asked several questions simultaneously. Logan put his hand on her shoulder. "This is my daughter," he said. "Sophie." Evelyn crouched down. Not in a performative way. Not the way politicians do when there are cameras and children and they need the optics. She just bent her knees and brought herself to Sophie's level and looked at her directly, which was something Sophie noticed because she tilted her head slightly the way she did when she decided she was paying attention. "Hi, Sophie." "Hi." Sophie studied her for a moment. "Are you the one in charge?" "Tonight, yes. My dad brought me because the card said it was a family event. He didn't RSVP because—" "I know," Evelyn said. "It doesn't matter." "It said on the card that you had to RSVP," Sophie said, because she was 9 and believed in accuracy. "So technically, it does matter a little, but we still should have been allowed to eat something." Logan closed his eyes briefly. Evelyn looked up at him over Sophie's head, and this time the expression was clear. Something warm and slightly worn at the edges, like a piece of fabric that had been washed enough times to become soft. She stood back up. "Come with me," she said. She led them to a quieter corner near the side of the ballroom, away from the stage and the tables where 400 people were very visibly pretending not to stare at them while absolutely staring at them. A waiter materialized with a tray, and Evelyn took 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed one to Logan, and crouched again to ask Sophie if she wanted Sprite or apple juice. And Sophie said, "Apple juice, please." And then the waiter was gone, and it was just the 3 of them in a bubble of relative privacy while the room hummed and murmured around them. Evelyn turned to Logan. "I looked for you," she said. It came out simply, without drama, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd made a production of it. "After. Honestly, it was embarrassing how much time and money I spent trying to find out who pulled me out of that building. Nobody could tell me. The foreman on site thought your name was Marcus. One of the contractors said you were a maintenance worker but couldn't describe you past big guy, dark jacket." Logan wrapped both hands around his water glass. "I didn't stick around. I know. Why not?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you were out. That was the thing I went in for." "You went back in?" "There was a section of the east wall that hadn't come down yet. I wasn't sure if anyone else was—" "You went back into a burning building," Evelyn said. "After you'd already gotten me out. That's what I'm saying." Logan was quiet for a moment. Nobody else was in there. "That's not actually the point I'm making." "I know what point you're making." He looked at his water glass. "I was out of the Navy about 8 months at that point. I was doing demo work on the Harlow Street renovation project 3 blocks over. I heard the explosion. I ran toward it because it's just a thing. When you hear that sound, you move toward it. You don't think about it. It's muscle memory from years of—" He stopped, looked up. "It wasn't heroism. It was habit." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. "Those aren't as different as you think." He didn't answer that. Sophie, who had been listening to all of this while drinking her apple juice, said, "Is that the scar?" Both adults looked at her. She was pointing at the left side of Logan's jaw, a thin, pale line about 2 inches long that ran at a slight diagonal. He'd had it so long that most people didn't notice it, or assumed it was old and didn't ask. "Sophie," Logan started. "I've always wondered where it was from," Sophie said to Evelyn, with the pure, undiluted frankness of a child who does not yet fully understand social filters. "He never tells me." Evelyn looked at Logan. Logan looked at his daughter. Sophie finished her apple juice. "Different story," Logan said finally. "Different day." "Was it dangerous?" "Most days were." Sophie considered this and apparently decided it was sufficient. She set her empty glass on a passing waiter's tray with the kind of casual confidence that 9-year-olds deploy when they're feeling comfortable in a space, and then she held her envelope up toward Evelyn. "I want to give this to the hospital," she said. "It's $43. I know that's not very much compared to what everyone else here is giving, but my dad said every dollar helps, and also I specifically didn't spend my birthday money, so it's like extra meaningful." Evelyn took the envelope carefully. She looked at the drawings, the colored pencil red crosses, the stick figures with bandages, the small, uneven letters across the front. She didn't say anything for a moment, and something moved across her face that she didn't try to conceal. "Can I open it?" she asked. Sophie nodded. Evelyn opened it. She counted the bills and coins without hurrying, laid out in her palm, a 20, a 10, a 5, 2 ones, and then a collection of quarters and dimes and nickels that Sophie had wrapped in a small piece of paper and secured with a rubber band. She closed her hand around it gently. "This is going in tonight," Evelyn said. "Personally. I'll make sure they know exactly where it came from." Sophie's face did something complicated and bright. "Okay," she said, like she was trying to sound casual about it. Well, Holt had not left. Logan noticed him still standing 20 feet away, near the edge of the main floor, in that particular posture of someone waiting to see how a situation resolves before deciding their next move. He had his hands clasped in front of him, and he was looking at the carpet, which Logan recognized as a man trying to work out whether he still had a job. Evelyn noticed too. She turned and looked at Holt with an expression that wasn't angry, which was in some ways more uncomfortable than anger. Anger is easy to respond to. Calm expectation is not. "Garrett," she said. He crossed the floor to her. "We need to talk about what happened tonight," she said. "Not right now. Tomorrow morning, my office. But I want you to think between now and then about the difference between following a protocol and using judgment. Those are not the same skill." She paused. "You've been with the company 4 years. You're good at your job. Tonight wasn't your best work." Holt's jaw was tight. "Understood, Ms. Carter." "Logan." She turned back to him. "Do you want to say anything to him?" Logan looked at Holt. Holt looked back, and in his expression there was something genuinely uncomfortable. Not the discomfort of a man who got caught doing something wrong, but the specific discomfort of a man who is realizing that the story he was telling himself about his actions doesn't hold up under scrutiny. That he'd made a snap judgment based on a jacket and a backpack and the absence of an RSVP, and that the person he'd tried to physically remove from the room had responded with more dignity than he'd brought to the encounter. Logan was quiet long enough that it started to become its own kind of answer. Then he said, "You were doing your job. I get it. We're good." Holt blinked. Yeah, thank you." A pause. "I apologize, Mr. Steele, genuinely." "Okay," Logan said. "Not it's fine, not don't worry about it, just okay." Acknowledgement without absolution, which was its own form of grace and its own form of honesty. Holt nodded once and stepped back. He would spend the rest of the evening on the far side of the room, and if you were watching closely, you'd notice that he wasn't looking at anyone's jacket for the rest of the night. What Logan didn't expect, what he genuinely hadn't prepared himself for, was that 400 people had heard Evelyn say his name, and 400 people had watched him stand in the middle of that room with his hand at his side and his daughter beside him, and not raise his voice and not make threats, and not collapse under the weight of being publicly humiliated in front of people who could have bought and sold the neighborhood he lived in. And then a 30-year-old billionaire CEO had walked in and crouched down to ask his daughter what she wanted to drink. And the whole thing had the quality of a scene from a story, the kind of scene you replay afterward because you want to make sure you remember it right. People talk at these events. That's the primary function of these events, actually. The charity is real, but so is the networking. And 400 people with sharp minds and a talent for reading situations had just watched something unfold in real time that gave them a lot to talk about. By the time Logan and Sophie returned to table 17 and a fresh plate of food had been placed in front of Sophie, who had immediately identified the shrimp she'd spotted earlier and was now systematically eating around everything else on the plate to save it for last. The whispers had been moving through the room for 10 minutes. The man at the adjacent table, who had been talking loudly about Singapore earlier, leaned slightly toward Logan. He was maybe 60, silver-haired, with a watch that had no numbers on its face, just hands. "Marcus Delaney," he said, extending his hand. "I run Delaney Capital." Logan shook it. "Logan Steele." "I heard what Ms. Carter said about the explosion." Delaney glanced down at the table, then back up. "The Kelmore factory fire? 3 years ago?" "I didn't know the name of it at the time." "That was all over the news. 6 people injured. 1 executive pulled out before the east side came down." Delaney was watching him carefully. "That was you." "She got out," Logan said. "That's what mattered." Delaney sat back. He had the expression of a man reassessing something. "What do you do now, for work?" "Construction." I do project management for a mid-sized firm. Residential mostly, some commercial. You're not... You didn't go back to the military? No. Logan reached over and moved Sophie's water glass back from the edge of the table where she'd pushed it absent-mindedly. I have a reason to come home now. Sophie looked up from her shrimp. Me? She told Delaney, by way of explanation. Delaney smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that moves your eyes. Yes, he said. I can see that. The program started at 8:30. A moderator took the stage and welcomed everyone and explained the evening's fundraising goals. The pediatric burn unit needed new equipment and a facility expansion. The rehabilitation wing was 3 months from breaking ground pending final funding. A new outpatient program for children with long-term injuries needed staff and resources. Numbers were cited. Projections were shown on the screen. The room listened with the attentive half-focus of people who were genuinely moved and also calculating. Logan sat through it with Sophie beside him, and he watched the faces around the room while the numbers went up on the screen, and he thought about the pediatric ward at Bethesda, where he'd visited a kid named Ortega after Ortega came back from a third deployment with both legs below the knee, gone, and how Ortega had made a joke about it within 48 hours because Ortega was incapable of not making jokes, and how the nurses there had done something impossible looking every single day and called it their job. He thought about what resources meant when you were working with nothing. He thought about what Sophie's $43 would look like next to tonight's total on some final accounting spreadsheet, and how it would be a rounding error, and how it wouldn't matter because she'd saved it, and it was real, and it was hers, and she'd chosen to give it. He didn't realize he'd been staring at the stage for a long time until Sophie nudged him with her elbow. "You're doing the face," she said quietly. "What face?" "The one where you're somewhere else." He looked at her. She was watching him with the specific attentiveness that she'd had since she was very small, that focused patient quality that her mother had also had, this ability to see him when he wasn't fully present and not be bothered by it, but also not let him disappear entirely. "I'm here," he said. "I know." She put her head briefly against his arm. "I'm just reminding you." At 9:15, Evelyn Carter took the stage. She looked entirely different from how she'd looked 20 minutes ago in the corner with them. Composed, focused, the comfortable authority of someone who'd been running rooms since her mid-20s. She'd taken the media headset off. She had note cards, but she wasn't looking at them. She thanked the board, thanked the sponsors, thanked the hospital's leadership team who were seated at a table near the front. She talked about the foundation's work over the past year, the number of children served, the outcomes they were tracking. She was good at this. Clean sentences, no filler, the kind of speaker who made you feel like she was talking specifically to you even when she was talking to 400 people. And then she stopped. She looked down at the note card in her hand. She looked at it for a beat longer than the speech required, and Logan, watching from table 17, had the sudden sense that she'd gone off script. "I want to tell you something that wasn't in my prepared remarks," she said. The room settled. 3 years ago, I was in a building that caught fire during a structural failure. I was on the 4th floor. I don't remember exactly how I got out. I was unconscious for part of it, and when I came to, I was on the sidewalk outside with a paramedic beside me and a lot of smoke in my lungs. She paused. Someone carried me out. I never knew who. I asked. I looked. I spent more time and more resources than I should probably admit trying to find out, and I never could. Logan went very still. Tonight, I walked into this ballroom and I nearly walked past him because the security team was in the middle of trying to remove him from the event for not having confirmed his RSVP. A few sounds from the room. Discomfort, recognition. He'd come with his 9-year-old daughter. She brought a donation envelope she'd made herself. $43 she saved specifically for tonight. Sophie had stopped eating. The man who carried me out of that building is named Logan Steele. He's a former Navy SEAL. He's a construction project manager. And for the last 4 years since losing his wife, he has been raising his daughter alone. Evelyn's voice didn't waver, but you could hear the effort in the steadiness, the specific texture of emotion being held carefully in place. He did not ask for recognition when he pulled me out. He didn't give anyone his name. He checked that I was breathing and went back into the building to check for anyone else. And by the time it was safe enough for the paramedics to get near the structure, he was gone. 400 people were looking at table 17. Logan did not look back at them. He was looking at the table. He had both hands flat on the tablecloth, and he was breathing slowly and deliberately, which was something he did when a situation required him to stay in his body and not let his instincts move him somewhere else. Sophie reached over and put her hand on top of his. He turned his hand over and held it. "I asked him tonight why he didn't stay," Evelyn continued. "Why he didn't tell anyone his name. What he said was—" She looked down at the note card, though Logan suspected she wasn't reading from it. He said, "Because you were out. That was the thing I went in for." The room was completely quiet. "I've given a lot of keynote speeches," Evelyn said. "I've talked about leadership, about innovation, about what it takes to build something that lasts. And all of that is real. But I've been thinking, since the moment I saw him standing there in that faded jacket, getting talked down to by my own security team, that the most useful thing I can do with the next 20 minutes of your time is not deliver the remarks I prepared." She set the note cards face down on the podium. "So I'm going to ask Logan Steele if he'd be willing to come up here instead." Logan's head came up. Evelyn was looking directly at him from the stage, across the full length of the ballroom, past 400 people and all that crystal and gold and carefully arranged flowers. "You don't have to," she said. "That's a real offer with a real no attached to it. But I think there are some things that this room needs to hear, and I think you're the one who should say them." Logan looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at him. Her hand tightened around his. "You should go," she said. "You'll be okay here?" She looked at him like he'd said something slightly ridiculous. "I'm 9, not 4. I'll be fine." She picked up her fork. "Go." Logan looked at her for another second. This small, serious, impossibly capable person who had walked into this room with $43 and an envelope covered in colored pencil drawings and hadn't flinched once. And then he pushed back his chair. He stood up. He walked across the ballroom floor with 400 pairs of eyes on him. And he didn't walk quickly, and he didn't walk slowly. He just walked, the way he'd been trained to move through spaces that felt dangerous, which was to say, as if you belonged there and you knew exactly what you were doing, even when you weren't entirely sure of either. He reached the stairs at the side of the stage. Evelyn met him at the top of them and extended her hand. He shook it. Up close, he could see that she was tired in the way that people who run things are always tired, bone-level tired, the kind you carry so long you stop noticing it. He recognized it because he saw the same thing in the mirror every morning. "You didn't warn me," he said, quiet enough for just her. "I know," she said. "Would you have said yes?" He thought about it honestly. "No." "I know," she said again. And she stepped aside and he was standing at the podium, and the room was in front of him. He looked out at 400 people in their tuxedos and their gowns, with their champagne and their watches and their portfolios, all of them very still, all of them watching him with expressions he couldn't fully read from where he stood. He looked at table 17 where Sophie had resumed eating her shrimp and was watching him over her fork with calm, steady brown eyes that said, "You've done harder things than this." He adjusted the microphone. It squeaked. He stepped back slightly and tried again. He cleared his throat. And then Logan Steele, who had not asked to be here, who had not asked to be noticed, who had spent 4 years doing the work in front of him without needing anyone to see it, opened his mouth and started to talk. He stood at the podium for a moment that felt longer than it was. The microphone had been adjusted for Evelyn, who was 5'4", and Logan was 6'1", so there was a brief, entirely unglamorous 30 seconds where he was tilting the stand and it kept slipping, and the metal made a grinding noise against the adjustment collar that carried clearly through the sound system. Someone near the front winced. Logan got it where he needed it, stepped back, looked out at the room. 400 people. He'd briefed generals with fewer nerves than this. He wasn't sure what that said about generals, or about charity galas, or about himself. "I'm not a speaker," he said. His voice came out even, which surprised him slightly. "I want to be upfront about that. I don't have note cards. I didn't prepare anything. So if this goes sideways, that's why." A ripple of something through the room. Not quite laughter. Acknowledgement, maybe. The sound of 400 people collectively deciding to meet him where he was. He looked at table 17. Sophie had put her fork down and was watching him with both elbows on the table, which he would normally have said something about, but not right now. "My daughter's name is Sophie," he said. "She's 9. She's currently doing the thing where she puts her elbows on the table, which we've talked about. Sophie immediately took her elbows off the table. A few people near the front laughed. Real laughs, small and warm. She saved $43 for tonight, Logan continued, since September. She skipped the vending machine at school for 2 weeks, which is, I want you to understand, for a 9-year-old, that is a significant sacrifice. She collects the little packets of goldfish crackers in her backpack like they're currency. Going 2 weeks without buying anything from that machine was genuinely hard for her. He wasn't sure where he was going with this. He'd started talking, and now he was just following it. She brought that money in an envelope she drew on herself. Red crosses, kids with bandages. She wanted it to go to the children's hospital because she said, and I'm quoting directly here, "Those kids need it more than I need goldfish crackers." He paused. She's been saying things like that since she was about 6. I don't know where she gets it. I'd like to take credit, but honestly, I think she just came out that way. The room was very quiet. The good kind of quiet. The kind where people are listening, not waiting. Logan put his hands on either side of the podium. He wasn't gripping it, just resting them there, something to anchor him. When Ms. Carter asked me to come up here, my first instinct was no. My second instinct was also no. I'm still not fully sure I've overridden those instincts, so bear with me. He looked out at the room. At the tables of people who ran things, companies, funds, foundations, industries. People who made decisions that affected thousands of other people. People who wore their authority like a second skin, comfortably, automatically, the way you stop noticing the weight of something you've carried long enough. I spent 11 years in the Navy, he said. SEAL teams mostly. I'm not going to tell you specific stories from that, because most of them aren't mine alone to tell. And also some of them I'd prefer not to relive at a dinner event. He saw a few nods in the room, Masul, people who understood that particular kind of restraint. What I will tell you is that the thing they work hardest to train into you, the thing that takes the longest and breaks the most people in the process, is not how to fight. It's how to judge. He let that sit for a moment. How to look at a situation in the first 3 seconds and read it accurately. Because in the environments I worked in, a wrong read didn't cost you embarrassment. It cost you your team. So you learn. You get very good at reading people fast. He straightened slightly. And then I got out. And I came home. And I started doing construction work. And what I found out pretty quickly is that the skills don't turn off. You're still reading people. You're still making snap judgments. The difference is that the stakes feel lower, so you stop checking your work. He glanced toward where Holt was standing, off to the side of the room. Holt was watching him. Logan held eye contact for a second, not aggressively, just directly. Tonight, someone looked at me and saw a man who didn't belong in this room. I'm not angry about it. I understand the instinct because I've had that same instinct pointed at other people and I've been wrong. The jacket I'm wearing, the one with my name stitched on it, I wore it tonight because it was cold and because I wasn't going to pretend to be something I'm not. And the second I walked in, I became a problem to be managed. He looked back at the room. I'm not telling you this to make anyone feel bad. I'm telling you this because every single person in this room has done the same thing to someone. Made a call in the first 3 seconds. Decided who somebody was before they'd said a word. I have. You have. We all have. He heard the room shift. Not discomfort exactly. More like the sensation of something true landing somewhere it wasn't entirely expected. My wife's name was Claire, he said. The shift in the room was immediate. He'd changed direction without warning, and people felt it. He hadn't planned to say her name tonight. He wasn't sure why he'd said it just then. But it was out, and it was real, so he continued. She died 4 years ago. Aneurysm. 31 years old, no warning, no lead-up. She went to sleep, and she didn't wake up. Sophie was 5. He took a breath that was steadier than he felt. I was in the middle of my last deployment. I got the call via satellite phone at 2 a.m, local time. I was on a hillside in a place I can't tell you about, in the dark, with guys I'd known for 6 years sleeping 10 feet away. And I just sat there with the phone in my hand for a long time. The room was completely still. Even the waitstaff near the back had stopped moving. I finished the deployment. There were 12 days left, and I finished them because there was a job to do, and because I didn't know what else to do, and because sitting still felt like something I couldn't survive. And then I came home. and Sophie was staying with Claire's mother, and she ran out to the car when I pulled into the driveway, and she was 5 years old, and she had on these little rain boots with frogs on them, and she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, Mama went away, and she's not coming back." His voice stayed level, just barely. She said it like she'd been practicing it, like she'd worked very hard to find the right words and she wanted to get them right when she saw me. He stopped. He looked at the tablecloth somewhere in the middle distance and gave himself exactly 3 seconds, which was a thing he'd taught himself to do. Give the feeling exactly 3 seconds of acknowledgement and then keep moving, because 3 seconds is enough to be honest and not enough to fall into. "I picked her up," he said. "Those little frog boots, this tiny person. And I told her I wasn't going anywhere, and that has been the only mission I've cared about since." He could see from the stage that several people at the tables near the front were not bothering to conceal that they were affected. A woman at table 4 had her hand over her mouth. A man 2 seats down from her was looking at the tablecloth with the specific posture of someone deciding whether to let something land or keep it out. Marcus Delaney at the table adjacent to 17 had both hands flat on the table and was looking at Logan with an expression that had nothing professional in it at all. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Logan said. "I'm genuinely not. I have a good life. I have a daughter who is, honestly, she's remarkable. And I don't say that because I'm her father. I say that because she walked into this room tonight with $43 and a hand-drawn envelope, and she was the least intimidated person here, including me." He paused. "What I'm telling you is that you cannot know what someone is carrying by looking at their jacket. You cannot know what someone has survived by checking their name on a list. You cannot know who is sitting next to you at a dinner table based on the car they arrived in." He looked across the room slowly, not performing it, just actually looking. "There are people in this room who have been in burning buildings," he said. "Not literal ones, necessarily, but the equivalent. People who've made the call to run towards something when everything in them said, run away. People who've held families together through things that should have broken them. People who've done hard and important and invisible work for years and never once been asked to stand on a stage and talk about it." He leaned forward slightly. "And there are people in rooms all over this city, all over this country, who are doing the same thing right now and who you will never meet because they don't get invited to places like this. Because nobody looked at them in the first 3 seconds and saw someone who belonged." He straightened. "I don't know what to do with that entirely. I don't have a solution to hand you. I'm a project manager from Queens, not a policy expert. But I know that Sophie's $43 is in this room tonight because a 9-year-old decided it mattered. And I know that nobody questioned whether she belonged here because she walked in without any self-doubt at all. She just walked in and started eating shrimp and coloring on her envelope." He glanced toward table 17. "She doesn't know yet that the world is going to tell her at some point that she should feel smaller than she does. I'm working on making sure that takes as long as possible." Something happened in the room. It wasn't a single sound or a single movement. It was more like a pressure change, the way the air shifts before weather comes through. People looking at each other. People looking at Sophie at table 17, who was now sitting up very straight with her hands in her lap and her chin slightly raised, because she understood from the way people were looking at her that her father was saying something about her, and she was determined to look like a person worth saying things about. She looked exactly like her father right then, and several people who were watching both of them noticed it and felt something about it that was hard to name. Logan had one more thing to say. He hadn't planned it. It arrived the way the truest things tend to arrive. Not as a decision, but as a recognition. "The man who tried to remove me tonight was following a rule," he said. "The rule made sense on paper, and I want to be clear, I don't hold it against him. Rules are how you manage complexity at scale. I know that. I spent 11 years operating under rules that kept everyone alive." He paused. "But there's a thing that happens when you follow a rule without looking at the person first. You stop seeing the person. You start seeing the category. And once someone becomes a category to you, a guest without RSVP, a worker who wandered in, a man in a faded jacket, you've already decided who they are, and nothing they do is going to change that read, because you stopped looking." He stepped back from the microphone. "That's it," he said. "That's all I had. I told you I wasn't a speaker." The applause started before he finished the sentence. It didn't start the way applause starts at events like this, though. that careful, measured clapping that says appropriate response being executed. It started at table 4 where the woman with her hand over her mouth put both hands together, and then at the table behind her. And then from Marcus Delaney, who was already standing, and from somewhere near the back of the room, and then it was everyone, and it was loud. And Logan was already stepping back from the podium and nearly walked into Evelyn, who was standing just off stage and whose expression he couldn't fully read because there was something in it that was several things at once. "I told you," she said, just loud enough for him over the applause. "You didn't tell me anything," he said. "You ambushed me. I told you this room needed to hear it. You could have warned me. You would have said no. I said that already, and I agreed with you already." She was almost smiling. That's how ambushes work. He wanted to be irritated about that. He wasn't, quite. He was something else, wrung out and raw and lighter than he'd expected, the way you feel after saying something true that you didn't know you needed to say. He descended the stage steps and walked back across the ballroom, and people reached out as he passed, hands on his arm, nods. A woman at one table who said thank you, simply and directly. A man who shook his hand and held it a beat longer than a standard handshake. Logan moved through all of it with the same composure he'd moved through everything else tonight, which was to say, imperfectly, with effort, keeping his breathing steady because that was the only thing he could reliably control. Sophie was standing up by the time he reached table 17, and she didn't hug him. She wasn't much of an initiator with physical affection. She'd been that way since she was small, careful about it, deliberate. But she stood up and looked at him and said very quietly, "That was good, Dad." From Sophie, that was everything. He sat down. She sat down. He poured himself a glass of water and drank most of it. She went back to her shrimp, which had gotten slightly cold, but which she did not complain about. "You said Mama's name," she said after a moment. Logan looked at her. "Yeah. You don't usually do that, out loud, with strangers." He thought about that. "No, I don't." "Was it okay?" He looked at her for a moment, this serious, careful, remarkable 9-year-old who asked whether it was okay for him to grieve out loud in public because she understood that this was a thing he monitored and protected and sometimes carried too quietly. "Yeah," he said. "It was okay." She nodded. She ate a piece of shrimp. "She would have thought this whole night was very funny," Sophie said. Logan let out a breath that was almost a laugh. She would have. She would have said something embarrassing. Absolutely. Probably about the tie. He looked down at his navy tie, the one with the fruit punch stain on the narrow end. He'd forgotten about it all evening. "Probably," he agreed. Sophie finished her shrimp. She looked up at him with those brown eyes that were her mother's eyes, fundamentally, the same shape and depth, the same quality of seeing you clearly and not minding what they found. "Are we still doing movie night?" she asked. He checked his watch. It was 9:52. The gala was scheduled to run until 11. He'd promised her movie night every Friday without exception for 4 years, in the same way he'd promised other things. In the way you make promises when you're the only one left to make them, when keeping them is the only way you know how to hold things together. "Yeah," he said. "We're still doing movie night." "Can we go soon?" 20 minutes, he said. "Let me get you some dessert first." She considered this. "Okay, but only if it's chocolate." He waved down a waiter. The applause had fully settled, and the program was resuming, and the room had returned to the warm, purposeful hum of a charity event doing what charity events do, which is to take money from people who have it and redirect it toward people who need it, and this part Logan had no complicated feelings about. He was glad the money was going where it was going. He was glad the Children's Hospital would get its equipment and its wing and its outpatient program. He was glad Sophie's $43 was somewhere in that total. He was also, quietly and privately, and without intending to share it with anyone, completely exhausted. He hadn't slept properly in 3 days. He had a project deadline Monday morning, a residential build in Flushing that had hit a concrete issue in the foundation and needed his sign-off on a fix that was costing his company more than they'd budgeted. His car needed an oil change he'd been putting off for 6 weeks. The zipper on Sophie's winter coat had broken, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. These were the actual contents of his life, underneath the thing that had just happened on stage. The speech was real. The feeling behind it was real. And tomorrow morning he would still be a single father in Queens with a project deadline and a broken zipper and an oil change he kept forgetting about. And that was also real, and the two things would exist together the way they always did. He got Sophie a piece of chocolate cake. She ate it methodically, saving the frosting for last, which was her consistent cake strategy. He ordered a coffee because the subway ride home was going to be cold. Around him, the gala continued, but something had shifted in the room since he'd come off that stage. He could feel it in the way people were moving, slightly slower, slightly more deliberate. People who'd been networking hard earlier in the evening were now actually talking to the people beside them, actually asking questions instead of positioning themselves. He couldn't take credit for that entirely. The speech he'd given wasn't that extraordinary. But sometimes a room needs one honest thing, and then it remembers how to be honest. The way a conversation can unlock after one person says the true thing they've been not saying. Marcus Delaney crossed the room and sat down in the empty chair across from him. "I want to ask you something," Delaney said, "and you can tell me to get lost. That's a genuine option on the table." Logan looked at him. "Okay. You said you manage projects, residential, some commercial." "That's right. You ever worked on anything larger scale? Infrastructure, development?" "I've managed a couple of commercial builds, nothing over 40 million. Delaney nodded slowly, in the way that people nod when they're processing information toward a conclusion they've already partially reached. "I'm developing a site in the Bronx, mixed use, residential over retail. My current project manager is," he paused, choosing his words, "having difficulty with the scope. I need someone who can hold a complicated thing together under pressure and not fall apart when it goes sideways." Logan said, "It always goes sideways." "I know, that's exactly what I mean." Delaney reached into his jacket and put a business card on the table. "I'm not pitching you tonight. I'm aware this is not the right moment, and I'm aware you may have zero interest. But if you want to have a conversation, call that number and ask for Rita. She'll put you on my calendar." Well, Logan looked at the card. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it for a moment, and then he said, "Why?" Delaney seemed to appreciate that he asked. "Because the way you handled yourself tonight, before the speech, before any of it, is more than I see from half the people who come through my office with MBAs and 5-year plans. You didn't lose your head. You didn't perform anything. You just," he searched for the word, "held." Logan looked at the card for another moment. Then he picked it up and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was the most honest answer he had, which was the only kind he knew how to give. Delaney stood. He nodded once, then turned and went back across the room to his table. Logan checked his watch. 9:58. He looked at Sophie, who had finished the cake and was watching him with the focused, patient expression that meant she'd been waiting for him to return to a conversation they'd started earlier. 20 minutes, he said. "You said that 8 minutes ago." "I did." "So technically it should be 12 minutes now." He looked at her. "You know, most 9-year-olds are not this precise." "I'm not most 9-year-olds." "No," he said. "You really aren't." He drank his coffee. She got out a small notebook from her backpack. She carried it everywhere, filled it with lists and drawings and observations, and started writing something in it with a pencil she'd had behind her ear all evening, which he'd also somehow not noticed until now. "What are you writing?" he asked. "The names of the foods I tried tonight," she said, "for my record." "You keep a food record?" "Since January." She didn't look up from the notebook. "It's a scientific log." He stared at her for a moment. "Sophie." "Yeah." "I really don't know where you come from sometimes." She looked up at him over the notebook, completely serious. "Queens," she said. He laughed, actually laughed, the kind that starts in your chest and arrives before you can organize it. A few people at the nearest table glanced over, but he didn't care. It was the best he'd felt all night. The dessert plates were being cleared when Evelyn found her way back to table 17. She'd spent the 20 minutes since Logan came off the stage doing the things a CEO does at a charity gala. Shaking hands, accepting compliments about the program, fielding 3 separate conversations about the rehabilitation wing's projected budget, and answering a question from the board treasurer that she didn't fully have the answer to but handled with enough confidence that he didn't notice. She was good at all of this. She'd been doing it since she was 26 and took over the company after her father's stroke, And she'd gotten good at it the way you get good at things you do constantly under pressure, not by enjoying them, but by learning which parts of yourself to deploy when. What she had not been good at tonight was the 20 minutes since Logan walked off that stage. She'd stood in the wings for a while after he descended, listening to the room come back to itself, watching the applause crest and settle. Her assistant had appeared at her elbow with a schedule reminder, and she'd waved it off. One of the board members had come to tell her that was a remarkable decision, and she'd said thank you without fully hearing it. She kept thinking about what he'd said about his wife, not the public part of it, not the message about judgment and visibility and the categories people become when you stop looking at them as people. That part she'd processed and agreed with and thought was genuine and well said and true. But the private part, the part that had clearly not been planned, the part where he'd said her name was Claire in the same register that someone uses when they've been careful about something for a long time and then suddenly aren't. That part had gotten into her chest somewhere and wasn't leaving. She'd lost her own father 3 years ago, 6 months after the factory fire. She knew what it was to carry someone's absence like a weight that didn't diminish, only became more familiar. She knew the specific way you learned to move around it, the way you restructured your entire life to accommodate the shape of what wasn't there anymore. What she hadn't done, what she hadn't had to do, was explain it to a child. What she hadn't done was come home to someone small who needed her to still be functional. She thought about Logan on that hillside, 12 days, finishing the deployment. She didn't fully understand that decision. She wasn't sure she needed to. She found him at table 17 with his coffee and Sophie's notebook, and Sophie was showing him something she'd drawn while Logan was on stage. A rough sketch of the ballroom chandelier, done in the same pencil she'd been using for her food log, with the proportions slightly off, but the sense of it unmistakable. "She's been drawing since she could hold a pencil," Logan said, not to Evelyn specifically, but to the general fact of Sophie's existence, the way parents sometimes speak about their children. Not bragging, just stating, as if they're still slightly surprised by this person they've produced. Sophie looked up when Evelyn sat down. "Hi again." "Hi again," Evelyn said. "What are you drawing?" "The lights." Sophie held up the notebook. "I'm going to try to paint it at home. I do watercolors. I'm not very good yet, but my art teacher says I have a good eye for structure." "Your art teacher is right," Evelyn said, looking at the sketch. She meant it. The girl had caught something essential about the chandelier. Not its individual parts, but its feeling, the way it sat in the room and pulled the light toward itself. "Thank you." Sophie said it without false modesty or excessive gratitude, which Evelyn appreciated. Children who'd been taught to simply receive a compliment without deflecting it or performing humility were rarer than they should be. Evelyn looked at Logan. "Can I sit for a minute?" "It's your event." "That's not what I asked." He gestured at the chair. She sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The room was in its late evening rhythm now. The formal program had wound down, and people were in the comfortable looseness of an event that had accomplished what it set out to do. Money had been raised. Connections had been made. Something unexpected had happened that gave everyone something to talk about that wasn't business. The string quartet had resumed in the back corner, something quieter than before, and the sound of it moved through the room like something trying not to intrude. "How much did you raise tonight?" Logan asked. "Final numbers won't be in until tomorrow, but it's tracking about 20% over last year's total." "Is that good?" "It's very good." "Good." He finished his coffee. "The burn unit expansion is going to cost what?" She looked at him. $4.2 million. "And you're clearing that tonight?" "Clearing it and then some." The rehabilitation wing was already funded. Tonight is operational budget for the outpatient program, plus the equipment list for the burn unit, plus whatever's left over goes into the pediatric research endowment. Logan nodded slowly. He was doing math, she realized. Not impressed by the numbers, but genuinely accounting for them, running the actual arithmetic of what the money meant in practical terms. "The outpatient program," he said. "What does that look like exactly?" She told him. She laid out the specifics. The staffing model, the number of children projected to be served in the first year, the partnership with 3 school districts in Brooklyn and the Bronx that would allow early referrals, the transportation component that was the piece she was most proud of, and that had been the hardest to fund because nobody wanted to put their name on a van fleet when they could put their name on a building. He listened. Actually listened, in a way that she'd learned to distinguish from the performance of listening that most people offered in rooms like this. The nodding, the eye contact maintained with the discipline of someone who knows that eye contact matters but isn't actually tracking the content. Logan tracked the content. He asked 2 questions that were specific and structural about the staffing ratios in the first year and whether the school district partnerships included data sharing agreements or just referral protocols. "You've dealt with organizational logistics before," Evelyn said. "The Navy runs on logistics," he said, "and construction project management is basically just logistics with concrete." "And dust," Sophie added, without looking up from her notebook. Logan glanced at her. "What?" "There's always so much dust when you come home." She said it matter-of-factly, the observation of someone who has done laundry. "Everything smells like sawdust. I find it in my backpack sometimes." "That's because you leave your backpack in the truck. Because there's nowhere else to put it when I come to site visits." "You're 9. You shouldn't be doing site visits." "I like site visits." She turned a page in her notebook. "Carlos lets me wear the hard hat." "Carlos is not making safety decisions. I am, and—" Logan stopped, looked at Evelyn. "She does site visits," he said, as if this explained everything. "I gathered," Evelyn said. "She has opinions about load-bearing walls." "I have one opinion," Sophie said. "They're important. That's my whole opinion." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tight. It wasn't laughter exactly. It was the sensation of being in the presence of something genuinely, quietly alive. A family that had been broken and rebuilt into something different from what it was, but no less real. Maybe more real in the way that things are more real after they've survived being tested. She had spent 3 years running a company that employed 11,000 people. She had made decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars. She had sat across from venture capitalists and hostile board members and regulatory bodies and competitors who wanted to absorb her company and had walked out of every room still holding what she'd come in with. She was not someone who was easily undone by things. But this small family at table 17, the hard hat opinion and the sawdust in the backpack and the way Logan had looked at his daughter when she said, "I'm not most 9-year-olds with such complete and uncomplicated pride." This had gotten somewhere underneath the professional surface in a way she hadn't braced for. "Logan," she said. He looked at her. "I want to do something. For Sophie's education." She said it directly because she didn't believe in circling things. Not as a transaction, not as a business decision. Because what you did 3 years ago, I'm here. I run a company. I go to sleep at night without wondering if I'll wake up. I have all of that because of 11 minutes in a burning building, and I have never been able to do anything with that knowledge because I couldn't find you. She met his eyes. "I'd like to fund her education, all of it, from now through whatever she decides to do." Logan was quiet. This was a different quiet from his other quiets. Not the composure under pressure quiet, not the processing information quiet. This was the quiet of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been offered help and doesn't fully know how to hold the offer. "I don't—" He stopped. "You don't have to answer tonight," she said. "That's not a condition. I'm not going anywhere. You can think about it. It's not that I'm not—" He looked at Sophie, who had looked up from her notebook and was listening now with the attentiveness that meant she'd caught the shift in tone and understood that something was being discussed that involved her. "Sophie, what are you doing?" "Listening," she said unabashedly. "I see that. Someone mentioned my education." "I heard you." Sophie put her pencil down. She looked at Evelyn with that direct, clear gaze. "Is it because of what my dad did in the fire?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "He doesn't like when people do things because of the fire," Sophie said. "He says it happened and it's done and he doesn't need it to mean anything." Evelyn looked at Logan. Logan was looking at the tablecloth. "She's not wrong," he said after a moment. "She's not," Evelyn agreed. "But it meant something to me, even if it doesn't have to mean something to you. I get to decide what it means to me." She leaned forward slightly. "You went back in, after I was out. Nobody asked you to. There was no reason to. You went back into a burning building on a pure decision, and that is the kind of thing that I don't know how to let go of without doing something with it." Logan raised his head. He looked at her for a long moment. Her mom had a college fund started, he said finally. Before. Claire had started it when Sophie was 2. There's money in it. Not enough for the full run, but it's there. I've been adding to it. Okay? She's smart. She's going to get into good places on her own. I know. I'm not offering because I think she can't. I'm offering because I can, and because the money I'd spend doing this is the smallest possible acknowledgement of what you gave me, and I'd like to do it. Sophie was watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone watching a negotiation in a language they mostly, but not entirely understand. Then she said, "Dad, let her." Logan looked at his daughter. "You work really hard," Sophie said. She wasn't performing it. She was just saying it, flat and plain, the way she said most things. "You come home tired a lot. You never complain about it, but I can tell. You make my lunch every morning even when you didn't sleep well. You come to every school thing even when there's a work thing at the same time. She stopped herself. Started again, more carefully. "You do everything. And this is someone who wants to help. You always tell me that letting people help isn't the same as needing them to." She looked at him. "You tell me that." Something moved across Logan's face. It was the particular expression of a man being handed his own words back by the person he loves most in the world. And it had the quality of something he couldn't argue with because the argument would prove the point against him. "That's different," he said. "How?" "That's for regular things. Carpooling, homework." "Dad!" Sophie picked up her pencil. "Just say yes." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Logan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Logan. Between them, the question sat. And around them, the gala continued its late evening movement. And somewhere in the back, the string quartet had shifted into something slow and uninsistent. "Thank you," Logan said. Quietly, without drama. The 2 words landed like something he'd carried from somewhere far away and set down on the table. Evelyn nodded. "Okay. I mean it." He looked at her directly. "I know I said it happens, and it's done, and I don't need it to mean anything. That's..." A short pause. "That's mostly true. But thank you for looking, for not just moving on." "I wasn't able to move on," she said simply. "I know, I could tell when you talked about it earlier. I appreciate that. Even if it..." He stopped. There was something in his expression that she didn't push on, because some things in people's faces are asking you to leave them alone, and she was good at reading that. "It's a lot to sit with," he said finally. "Someone else's..." He didn't finish the sentence. "Yeah," she said. "It is." They sat with that for a moment, neither of them needing to clarify it. It was Sophie who moved them forward. She had a quiet talent for this, sensing when a moment had been fully had and needed to be released, and doing it without fanfare. "Ms. Carter," she said. Evelyn looked at her. "Did you eat the shrimp? Because it was really good, and you might want to ask if there are more." Evelyn blinked. Then she smiled, and this one was different from every other smile she'd produced tonight. Genuinely unguarded, without any professional architecture supporting it. "I haven't eaten anything," she admitted. "You should fix that," Sophie said. "People make bad decisions when they're hungry. My dad taught me that." "Your dad is right." "He usually is. Don't tell him I said that." Logan said, "I'm sitting right here." "I know," Sophie said, and went back to her notebook. Oh, Garrett Holt found Logan near the coat check at 10:20. Logan had retrieved his canvas work jacket and was holding it over his arm, waiting while Sophie extracted the things she needed from her coat. She'd worn her winter coat over the dress and had apparently been using its pockets as a secondary storage system for the notebook, 2 pencils, a granola bar wrapper, and a small rubber frog that Logan stared at for a moment with the expression of a man who has learned to stop asking about certain things. "Mr. Steele!" Logan turned. Holt was standing a few feet away, no earpiece now, hands at his sides. Off-duty posture. His face had a different quality from earlier in the evening. The professional blankness was gone, and what was underneath it was something more human and less comfortable. "Hey," Logan said. Holt glanced at Sophie, who was busy reorganizing her coat pockets. "I owe you a better apology than what I gave you before," he said. "That one was in front of people, and it was..." I did it because it was the right thing to do, but I did it publicly, which meant part of me was managing my own situation while I was doing it. That's not a real apology. Logan looked at him. I profiled you, Holt said. The word sat there bluntly, and from the look on Holt's face, he'd chosen it deliberately, because the less honest version would have been easier to say and would have let him off the hook he clearly wanted to stay on. I made a call in the first 30 seconds based on your jacket and your bag, and I moved toward you because of what I assumed about who you were. And I should have just talked to you, asked you. He stopped, started again. I'm good at my job. I've been doing security work for 12 years, and He shook his head. I don't have an excuse for it. Logan regarded him. Why are you telling me this? Because you were gracious before, up there. Holt nodded toward the ballroom. What you said, about snap judgments, about losing sight of people. I've been standing here since you got off the stage thinking about how many times I've done that and told myself I was doing my job. He looked uncomfortable in the way that people look when they're saying something that they haven't quite caught up to emotionally yet. You didn't call me out up there. You could have. You had 400 people listening, and you could have made tonight about what happened, and instead you made it about something bigger. I noticed that. Logan looked at him for a long moment. What's your story, Garrett? Holt blinked. I'm sorry? What's your story? What were you doing before this job? Holt seemed uncertain why he was being asked. NYPD, 8 years. Why'd you leave? Medical, shoulder. He moved it slightly, a small unconscious motion. Took a fall during a pursuit. Rotator cuff. It got better enough for light duty, but not enough for active patrol, so eventually He shrugged the shoulder that wasn't injured. Event security made sense. Different environment. Logan nodded slowly. You came from a world where the wrong call got people hurt. Yes. So you built yourself into someone who makes the call fast, because fast was what kept everyone safe. Holt was quiet. That's not a character flaw, Logan said. That's training. I know it because I'm the same way. He held Holt's gaze. The work is figuring out when to override it. Which situations need the fast call and which ones need you to slow down and actually look. Nobody teaches you that part. You have to figure it out by getting it wrong and caring enough about it to change. Holt was quiet for a moment. Something was working through his expression that was hard to watch because it was the specific process of a person being given more understanding than they thought they deserved. How do you do that? Holt said. Care enough to change, without it eating you alive. Logan thought about that honestly, because it was an honest question. I'm not sure you can, he said, finally. I think some of it eats you. I think some things should eat you a little. The trick is making sure it's the version that changes you and not the version that just damages you. He put on his jacket. You're already doing it. You came over here. Holt nodded. A single nod, carrying more weight than a single nod typically does. Okay, he said. Okay, Logan said. They didn't shake hands. It didn't need a handshake. There was something between them now that was smaller and more durable than whatever would have fit that gesture. Holt turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Logan watched him go. Sophie appeared at his elbow, coat buttoned, backpack settled, rubber frog visible in her right hand, which she was apparently not going to explain or apologize for. Was that the man from before? She asked. Yeah. You were nice to him. He deserved it. She considered this. He didn't seem like he thought he did. That's usually when people need it most, Logan said. Sophie looked at the rubber frog in her hand, back at her father. That's a very wise thing to say. Thank you. You should write it down somewhere. I'll remember it. You won't, she said, with the brisk certainty of someone who has extensive data on this point. You never write down the good things you say? You should start a notebook like mine. He looked at her. You keep a notebook, a food log, and a scientific record of chandelier drawings. You're 9. Almost 10, she corrected. My birthday is in 6 weeks and 4 days. I know when your birthday is. Then you know that pretty soon I'll be in double digits. And once I'm in double digits, I'm probably going to have even more notebooks. He put his hand on the top of her head, briefly, lightly. Not the sentimental gesture it might have looked like from outside, but what it actually was, which was a touchstone. a small physical confirmation of her existence that he'd been doing since she was an infant and probably would be doing when she was 30. She tolerated it the way she always tolerated it, a brief tilt into it before pulling away with the dignity of a person who is almost in double digits and has a reputation to maintain. "Come on," he said. "Movie night." "Finally," she said. They were almost to the lobby when Evelyn caught up to them. She was moving quickly and had her coat over her arm and the tablet her assistant usually carried, and she looked slightly different from how she'd looked all evening, less composed in a way that was better, actually, less of the gala and more of the person underneath it. "Logan, one more thing." He stopped. Sophie stopped beside him, reading the energy. "I'm announcing something tonight before the gala closes," Evelyn said. "I wanted to tell you before you heard it from someone else." She took a breath. Carter Enterprises is launching a veteran transition program, employment initiative, partnering with companies across 6 sectors to create direct hire pipelines for veterans moving into civilian careers. Project management, logistics, construction, infrastructure, operations. She was watching him carefully. "It's been in development for about 8 months. I was going to announce it as a company initiative. Tonight changed what I want to say about where it came from." Logan looked at her. "Evelyn, I want to say it was inspired by you," she said. "Not as a PR thing, because it's true. The gap between what veterans can do and what they're given the chance to do, I've been thinking about that since the fire, since I started actually looking into who you might be and what your life looked like after the military. I found a lot of things I didn't expect." She paused. "A lot of people in situations that should be different." He was quiet. "You can tell me not to use your name," she said. "I'll respect that completely." He stood in the lobby of the Meridian Grand with his canvas work jacket on and his daughter beside him holding a rubber frog. And he thought about the men he'd served with. He thought about Ortega, who was working at a grocery distribution center in Albuquerque because it was the first job that had said yes. He thought about Ramirez, who had 3 combat deployments and was in his 2nd year of a paralegal certification program at 41 because nobody in the field he was qualified for would look at his resume without the right acronyms on it. He thought about what it meant for someone with resources to build an actual door where there was currently a wall. "Use my name," he said. She nodded. Something in her face settled. Not relief, exactly. Resolution. The feeling of something finally being where it was supposed to be. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Just make it real." "That's the only kind I make," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. Close enough that she saw it. "Go announce it," he said. "We have a movie to catch." She looked at Sophie. "What are you watching?" Sophie named a movie that had come out 3 weeks ago, the latest in an animated franchise she had followed with a loyalty that Logan found slightly exhausting, given that he'd sat through 6 of them. Evelyn laughed, that same unguarded laugh from earlier, the one that arrived before she could make it presentable. "I've been meaning to see that." "It's very good," Sophie said seriously. "The 3rd act has some pacing issues, but the emotional payoff mostly works." Both adults stared at her. "What?" Sophie said. "You're 9, Evelyn said. "Almost 10, Logan and Sophie said simultaneously. Logan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Logan. Something passed between them, not romantic, not strategic, just human. 2 people who had met in the middle of something unexpected and had been, against all reasonable expectation, honest with each other. "Take care of yourself," Evelyn said. "You too," he said. He meant it in the plain, simple way that people mean it when they don't have anything to perform. She took it the same way. He and Sophie walked through the brass revolving doors of the Meridian Grand and out into the October night, and the cold hit them both immediately, and Sophie pulled her coat tighter and said, "Finally," again. And Logan zipped his work jacket up to the collar, and they walked toward the subway together, Sophie's hand in his, her notebook tucked under her other arm, the rubber frog presumably back in her coat pocket. Behind them, inside, Evelyn Carter walked back into the ballroom to finish the evening. Ahead of them, 45 minutes by train, was their couch and the remote and a blanket they shared because the apartment got cold at night, and Logan had been meaning to call the super about the radiator for 2 weeks. Sophie started telling him her analysis of the animated franchise's character development arc. somewhere around the corner of 57th and Park, and he listened the way he always listened to her, completely, without checking his phone, without half his attention somewhere else, because this was the job, and it had always been the job, and it was the one he would choose above every other one, every time. The city moved around them the way New York moves at night, indifferent and alive and full of 1,000 other stories happening in every direction, none of them aware of the others, all of them real. Logan Steele walked his daughter to the subway and felt, in a way he couldn't fully articulate and wouldn't have tried to, that the evening had cost him something and given him something, and that the accounting of it was more complicated than either column suggested. But Sophie was still talking, and the train would come, and Friday movie night waited at the end of the line. That was enough. That had always been enough. The 4 train was not crowded at 10:30 on a Friday night, but it wasn't empty either. They found 2 seats together near the middle of the car. Sophie took the window side out of habit. She always took the window side. Not to look out of it, since there was nothing to see in the tunnel except their own reflections, but because she liked the feeling of having a wall on one side and her father on the other, which she had never explained out loud, but which Logan had understood for years. He settled in beside her, and she immediately leaned her weight slightly against his arm. Not dramatically, just a degree or two, the way she did when she was tired but wasn't going to say so because admitting tiredness felt like surrender. The train lurched into motion. For a while, neither of them spoke. The car rattled around them, and a man across the aisle was reading something on his phone with the concentrated frown of someone dealing with a work email on a Friday night, and 2 teenagers near the door were sharing earbuds and having a quiet argument about something that had the cadence of an ongoing debate rather than a new one. Normal Friday night on the 4 train. The city in its regular motion. Sophie had her notebook open on her knee, but she wasn't writing in it. She was looking at the page she'd been on, the chandelier sketch, with the unfocused gaze of someone who is thinking about something else entirely. Logan was looking at the floor of the train car, which had the particular griminess of public transit in October, wet and tracked over. He was thinking about Ortega. He did that sometimes. Thought about the people he'd served with the way you check on things that matter to you, running a mental inventory, noting what you know and what you don't. Ortega in Albuquerque. Ramirez in his paralegal program. A guy named Dawes who'd gotten out 2 years before Logan did and was working construction in Portland last Logan heard, which was 18 months ago. A woman named Kim Yi who'd been in his unit for the last 3 years of his service and was now doing private security consulting and had texted him Happy New Year in January and nothing since. He thought about what Evelyn had said about the veteran transition program. 6 sectors, direct hire pipelines. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned over project plans, looking for the structural weaknesses, the places where good intentions met institutional friction and good intentions lost. He'd seen enough initiatives in enough context to know that the distance between an announcement and an outcome was where most things died. The announcement was easy. The outcome required someone to keep showing up after the cameras left. He hoped Evelyn was that kind of person. He thought she might be. "Dad," Sophie said. "Yeah." "Do you think she'll actually do it? The program?" He looked at her. She was still looking at the chandelier sketch, which meant she'd been thinking about the same thing he had, independently, the way she sometimes tracked conversations he thought had gone over her head and then surfaced them later when it was just the 2 of them. "I think she will," he said. "How can you tell?" He thought about how to say it accurately. The way she talked about it, she had specifics. 8 months of development, 6 sectors. She wasn't making it up in the room. She'd been working on it already. She just hadn't said your name yet. "Right." Sophie turned that over. "Does it feel weird, having your name attached to something that big?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the tunnel walls rushed past. The same gray concrete with the same occasional maintenance light. The same darkness between them. "A little," he said. "Yeah." "Because you didn't do it for that." "No. But it's still good. The thing that's happening because of it." "Yes. It's still good." Sophie seemed to find this an acceptable resolution. She put her pencil behind her ear and closed the notebook on her knee. "My teacher, Mr. Okafor, says that the best things people do are usually the things they did when nobody was watching, because those are the ones that are real." Logan looked at his daughter. "Mister." Okafor said that. In October, we were talking about integrity. She picked at a loose thread on her coat sleeve. I thought about you when he said it. I didn't tell him that. It felt too personal to say in class. He didn't say anything for a moment. There was a feeling in his chest that he'd learned to be careful with. Not because it was bad, but because it was so large that if he looked at it directly, it became hard to do the practical things that needed doing. The feeling of being known, of having someone see the specific thing you tried to be and recognize it. He'd had that with Claire, and he'd thought for a while after she died that it was gone, that kind of being known, that it had been a specific property of her seeing him and couldn't be replicated or replaced. He'd been wrong. It had come from a different direction and a different set of eyes, and it still wasn't the same as what he'd had with Claire. It was its own thing, its own shape. But it was real. Thank you, he said, for thinking of me. Well, Sophie said, with the particular tone of someone who considers the point obvious, you're pretty much the main person I think about. I know that. He put his arm around her briefly, and she leaned into it this time without the dignity calculation, just leaned in, and he held on for a moment before she straightened back up. The train pulled into their station at 10:58. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that had been built in the 1960s and maintained with the specific inconsistency of a landlord who fixed things that broke dramatically and ignored things that degraded slowly. The elevator worked 4 days out of 5. The hallway light on the second floor flickered. The radiator in the living room made a knocking sound between November and March that Logan had been told by 3 separate people was normal, and by one, Plumber, was not normal, and he hadn't fully resolved which camp to believe. Sophie went straight for the bathroom when they got inside, coat dropped on the chair by the door, in defiance of the hook he'd installed at her height, specifically for this purpose. He picked it up and hung it. He hung his own work jacket next to it. He loosened the navy tie and left it on the counter and thought about whether to deal with the fruit punch stain this weekend or continue to defer it, which had been the decision he'd made every weekend for 3 years. He put the kettle on. He'd switched to tea at night about a year ago because he'd noticed the coffee was affecting his sleep, and his sleep was already something he tended carefully, like a plant that needed specific conditions to survive. Claire had always been the tea drinker. He'd switched over so gradually he hadn't noticed until one day he reached for the kettle at 9 p.m. without thinking about it and realized it had become a thing he did. He didn't think she'd intended to transfer the habit. It had just happened. There were a few things like that. Small inheritances from 4 years of living together, things she'd done that he'd absorbed without registering, that had become his now because she wasn't around to take them back. He thought about it sometimes without sadness, or without sadness only, more with the quality of attention you give something that matters to you and that you don't want to take for granted. Sophie came out of the bathroom with her hair down, braids undone, wearing the oversized sweatshirt she used as pajamas in the shoulder season, before it got cold enough for the flannel ones. She had the rubber frog in her hand. Where did the frog come from? Logan asked, because now they were home and he felt he could ask. Danny Kim gave it to me, from the treasure box. I got a perfect score on my fractions test, and Ms. Ellison let me pick from the treasure box, and I picked the frog. When was this? Tuesday. Why is it in your coat pocket? Sophie considered this with genuine seriousness. I wanted it near me. He could not think of a response to that. What are we watching? Sophie asked, moving to the couch and pulling the shared blanket over her legs before she'd fully sat down, a logistical move he'd watched her perfect over several months. Your choice, he said. I told you we were doing your movie. I know, but you always say that and then you look at me like you're hoping I'll pick something that isn't animated. He opened the cabinet where the tea bags were. I never look like that. Dad? I support all your film choices. You fell asleep during the second one. I was tired that night. You fell asleep during the opening credits. He put a tea bag in his mug. Put the movie on, Sophie. She picked up the remote with the satisfaction of someone who has made their point and no longer needs to labor it. The television came on and she navigated to the streaming service and found the animated franchise she'd been tracking and selected it. And the opening titles began with the particular sweeping orchestral energy of films that are trying to establish their epic credentials in the first 30 seconds. Logan brought his tea to the couch. He settled in next to Sophie, who had already claimed 2/3 of the blanket, which was also standard. He pulled the remaining third over his lap. "Okay," he said. "Shh," she said. "It's starting." "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." "I wasn't." "You had the face." He looked at the television screen. "I'll be quiet." "Thank you," she said, as if he'd agreed to something reasonable after a prolonged negotiation. He did not fall asleep during the opening credits. He watched the first 20 minutes with genuine attention, partly because the animation was genuinely good, and partly because Sophie provided a running commentary at a volume calibrated to be quiet enough that she could claim she wasn't talking, but loud enough that he could hear every word. She pointed out a background detail in the third scene that paid off in the 13th scene, which she'd caught on a previous viewing and was deeply proud of. She correctly predicted a plot development 20 minutes before it happened, and turned to him with an expression of absolute vindication that he acknowledged with a nod because it was earned. Around the 40-minute mark, while Sophie was absorbed and quiet and the tea had gone from hot to warm, Logan's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Unknown number, text message. "This is Marcus Delaney. Got your number from Evelyn Carter. Hope that's all right. I meant what I said tonight. Call Rita when you're ready. No rush. The project isn't going anywhere fast." MD Logan read it twice. He set the phone face down on the armrest. He thought about the Flushing project, the concrete issue in the foundation. Monday morning sign-off. The scope of what Delaney had described, mixed use, residential over retail, Bronx development, was larger than anything he'd managed, but the gap wasn't unbridgeable. He'd been operating at the ceiling of his current firm for 2 years. His boss, a decent man named Featherstone, who ran the company with the particular combination of competence and timidity that kept it medium-sized indefinitely, had told him in April that there wasn't a path to a senior partnership in the structure they currently had. He'd said it apologetically, which Logan had appreciated. Featherstone wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't building something bigger. Logan reached over and picked up the phone again. He looked at the message one more time. Then he set it down. Not yet. Not tonight. Tonight was the couch and the blanket and Sophie's commentary on animated franchise character development. Tonight was what it had been for 4 years. The small, specific, irreplaceable thing he'd built from the wreckage of what had ended, and that he would not spend in any currency other than full attention. Monday could hold Delaney. Tuesday could hold Featherstone. The concrete foundation issue would still be there at 7 a.m. Right now there was the movie and the tea, and his daughter, who had at some point in the last 10 minutes migrated from her side of the couch to his side and was now pressed against his arm with the blanket pulled up to her chin and her eyes still on the screen, tracking the story with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about. "This is the good part," she said quietly. On screen, the main character was in the middle of a loss. It was handled with the specific gentleness that good animated films bring to grief. Not avoiding it, not softening it into something clean, but sitting in it long enough that you could feel its actual weight before the story moved through it. Sophie had gone still beside him. She wasn't commentating anymore. He looked at the side of her face, the focused brown eyes, the slight furrow in her brow that appeared when something affected her and she was concentrating on it. Claire's eyes in his daughter's face. He'd stopped being ambushed by that resemblance about a year ago. Now he just noticed it, the way you notice the shape of something you love. "Yeah," he said, quiet enough not to break it. "It is." The movie ended at 12:47 in the morning. Sophie had made it through the whole thing. No small achievement, she pointed out, given that they'd gotten up early and attended a major social event and taken the subway twice. She said this in the tone of someone filing a report on their own endurance for the record. Logan acknowledged it and told her she could sleep in tomorrow, which she said she would, which he knew from experience was optimistic on both their parts, because she had an internal alarm clock that seemed to have been calibrated to 7:15 and could not be reasoned with. She brushed her teeth. He checked the door and turned off the kitchen light and did the small procedural circuit of the apartment that he'd done every night for 4 years. The habit that had started as a need to confirm that the perimeter was what it should be, and had softened over time into something more like saying goodnight to the place itself. He looked in on Sophie. She was in bed reading from the small lamp on her nightstand. She always read for a while before sleep, had since she was 6, had worked through an amount of books that her school librarian described as concerning in the most admiring possible way. Tonight she was reading something he didn't recognize, thick enough that she was using her water bottle to hold her place when she set it down. "Lights out in 10, he said from the doorway. 20, she said without looking up. 15, okay. She turned a page. He leaned against the door frame. The lamp made a circle of warm light around her. The rest of the room was in the blue dark of a city night, not fully dark because it never got fully dark in Queens, always the ambient orange of the sky, giving everything just enough light to navigate by. Her chandelier sketch was pinned to the corkboard above her desk, among a collection of other drawings and school papers, and a photo of the two of them from last summer at Rockaway Beach, Sophie squinting into the sun and Logan looking at the camera with the half expression of a man who is not entirely comfortable being photographed but is doing it for his kid. He looked at all of it for a moment. He thought about what it had taken to get here. Not to this room specifically, but to the version of himself who could stand in a doorway and look at his daughter reading and feel, underneath the exhaustion and the to-do list and the Monday morning deadline, something that qualified as okay. Something that qualified, on its better days, as good. He'd spent a long time not believing he'd get here. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way that would have warranted intervention, just in the quiet, procedural way that grief works on you when you're functional enough to keep going, but haven't yet figured out the difference between going through the motions and actually living. He'd been going through the motions for probably 18 months before Sophie, who was 6 and had no language for what she was noticing but noticed it anyway, had looked at him at breakfast one morning and said, "Daddy, you seem far away a lot." He'd thought about that sentence for weeks. He'd started coming back from wherever he'd gone. It was slow. It was imperfect. There were weeks that were better and weeks that weren't, and there were nights when Sophie was asleep and the apartment was quiet, and the absence of Claire was so specific and physical that it felt like a sound he couldn't unhear. He didn't think that would entirely stop. He'd stopped expecting it to stop, which was different from resignation and closer to accommodation. The difference between fighting the shape of things and learning to move around them without losing yourself. He'd learned to move around it most days. "Dad," Sophie said. "Yeah." She put her book down on the blanket and looked at him with an expression that had the quality of something she'd been preparing. He recognized that quality. She got it when there was something she'd been holding that she'd decided it was time to say. "Tonight was a lot," she said. "Yeah, it was." "Were you scared when you went up on stage?" He thought about the honest answer. "A little." "You didn't look it." "I know." She considered him. "Is that a Navy thing? Not looking scared?" "Part of it," he said. "Part of it is just practice. You do enough things that scare you and you get better at not wearing it." "Does it still scare you inside, though?" "Yeah, it still scares you inside." She absorbed this. "That's good, I think. Miss Ellison says the things that stop scaring you inside are the things you've stopped caring about." He stood in the doorway and thought that Mr. Okafor and Ms. Ellison were doing better work than most people would ever know. "What did you think?" he asked. "Of tonight? All of it." Sophie picked at the corner of her book's cover, the way she did when she was actually thinking rather than just formulating. "I think it was important," she said. "I think you said true things. I think the lady, Miss Carter, I think she's a real person, not like fake nice." "Yeah," Logan said. "I think so too." "And I think—" She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "I think Mama would have been at that table instead of going to wait in the lobby. She would have stayed for the whole thing." He hadn't expected that. The specificity of it, the particular way Sophie had imagined Claire into the evening, not in a vague I miss her way, but in a concrete situational way that meant she thought about her mother's personality and preferences and applied them to new contexts, kept building the image of her even now, 4 years on. "Yeah," he said, and his voice came out slightly different than he'd meant it to. "She absolutely would have stayed. She would have asked the waiter for more shrimp, multiple times. And she would have cried at the speech, definitely. But like privately, she would have hidden it." Logan looked at the ceiling for a second. "She would have been holding a napkin under her eye, trying to look casual." Sophie smiled. The real one, the one that went all the way up, that had been Claire's smile before it was Sophie's, and that Sophie gave out carefully and that he had never taken for granted. "I miss her," Sophie said. Simply. No performance, just the plain, clean truth of it. "I know," he said. "Me too. But tonight was still good." "Yeah." He looked at her. "Tonight was still good." She picked her book back up. 15 minutes, she said. "I'll turn it off at 15. "Okay." He stayed in the doorway another moment. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for exactly. Maybe nothing. Maybe he just wanted one more second of this. The lamp and the book and his daughter and the particular quality of a Friday night that had been more than he'd expected it to be, that had asked more of him than he'd planned to give and had given him more than he'd planned to receive. He thought about the $43 in Evelyn Carter's hand, the stick figures with bandages, the careful block letters, for the kids who need it more. He thought about what Sophie had said on the train, "You're pretty much the main person I think about." He thought about Claire on a hillside 12 days after a phone call, a specific and unresolvable piece of the past, a thing he'd carried so long it had stopped having sharp edges and had become instead just a part of his own weight, something he factored into how he moved. He thought about Holt, standing off to the side of a ballroom, deciding to come find him and say the harder version of the apology, because the easier version wasn't the true one. He thought about what it cost a man to do that and what it said about a man that he was willing to pay it. He thought about what he'd said on stage, the things he hadn't known he had in him until they were already out, about categories and snap judgments and the work of actually looking. He wasn't sure he'd said it perfectly. He was sure it was true, which was the only credential he had for saying it. He thought about Delaney's business card in his shirt pocket. Rita, the Bronx Development Project, a larger scope, a different ceiling. He thought about what it meant to decide you were ready for the next thing, and how you never really knew if you were, and how the only way to find out was to say yes and see what you were made of under the new weight. He'd said yes to things before when he wasn't sure he was ready. Every single time, the not being sure had turned out to be beside the point. You either held or you didn't, and the only way to know was to be under the weight. He was still holding. He thought he had more left in him. "Good night, Bug," he said. "Night, Dad." She didn't look up from the book. "Thanks for taking me tonight." He stood there a moment longer. "Thanks for bringing the envelope," he said. She turned a page. "I told you $43 helps." "You did? You should listen to me more." "I'll add it to the list." He pushed off the doorframe and pulled her door to the 3/4 position she preferred. Not closed, not fully open, 3/4, because she'd been specific about this since age 6, and he'd never pushed back on it because it was the kind of thing that was easy to give someone, and that meant more than it looked like from outside. He went to his own room. He sat on the edge of the bed and took off his dress shoes, which he hadn't worn since he couldn't remember when, and put them back in the box at the top of the closet, where they lived mostly undisturbed. He hung the dark slacks. He set the navy tie on the dresser and looked at the fruit punch stain on the narrow end. He'd clean it this weekend. He'd thought that before. But this time he found himself meaning it differently. Not as a thing to manage, but as a small continuity, a piece of cloth connected to a birthday 3 years gone, and a 5-year-old in frog boots and every Friday since, and he wanted to take care of it. Not because it mattered in the scale of things, because the small things were the scale of things, finally. That was what he'd figured out in 4 years of doing this alone. The small things were not the stuff between the important moments. They were the important moments. The lunchbox every morning, the 3/4 door, the tea at 9 p.m., the movie every Friday. You built a life out of the small things, or you didn't build one at all. He lay down. The city made its noise outside the window. A car, a voice somewhere below, the ambient hum that never fully went quiet. He'd stopped noticing it years ago. It was just the sound of the place, the background frequency of being where he was. He thought he'd lie awake for a while. He usually did, his brain running the day's accounting, itemizing what had happened and what it meant and what came next. But the day had been long, and the saying of true things in front of 400 people had cost something real, and somewhere between thinking about Monday's concrete problem and thinking about what it would mean to call Rita and thinking about Sophie's 7:15 internal alarm clock and thinking about Claire holding a napkin under her eye, trying to look casual, he stopped thinking. He slept. In the next room, Sophie read for exactly 15 minutes. He would never know whether this was an accident or whether she'd actually tracked it, and then turned off her lamp and lay in the dark with the rubber frog on the nightstand beside her water glass, which was where she put things she wanted near her. Outside, New York continued, indifferent and alive and full of 1,000 other lives in every direction, none of them aware of the others, all of them real. And in a third-floor apartment in Queens, a former Navy SEAL and his almost 10-year-old daughter slept, and the radiator knocked once against the quiet, and the city held them the way cities hold everyone, impersonally, incompletely, and all the same, which was, in the end, enough, which had always, in the end, been enough.